everybody. I'm so glad to see you back here today for the finale of the BFG. It always makes me a little bit sad when I get to the very end of a book. Excited to see how it ends, of course. But I always miss the characters. So there's like Sophie and the BFG and just getting to spend time with them every day. I usually read at night, and I just love that time of opening my book back up and getting to spend a little bit of time with my characters. And so sometimes I read books that are in a series, because when I finish this one, I can go to the next one and my characters are still there. But there's a lot of books in the library, and these are the ones kids don't pick up so much that are, I call them oneies, where the author just wrote one and there is no sequel. There's nothing that comes after it. And as you can see with this one, they're really great books to read. So we're going to finish this one up, say goodbye to Sophie and the BFG, and we'll start a new one tomorrow. Well, we left off when all of the giants were sleeping and they were being tied up by the head of the army and the head of the Air Force and all of their helpers, and the flesh lump eater woke up and he was seeing all the people there and screaming and howling, and Sophie had a little brooch, a pin that the queen had given her, and she took it off and there's a little pin on the back of it and she poked it right in his ankle, which really shouldn't have hurt a big giant like that very much, but he howled and he yowled. He was a big baby about it. So the BFG said, hey, you've been bitten by a venomous snake. And that made him howl all the more. And he said, hey, bend your arms down here and I will help you. And at that moment, he tied him all up. And this is where we left off. I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth, said the BFG as he pulled the knot tight. Do it quickly, shouted the flesh lump eater, before I is pizened to death. Oh, there we is, said the BFG, standing up. You can look now. When the flesh lump eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and wiggled and fought and figgled and squirmed and squiggled, but there was nothing he could do. Well done, you, Sophie said. Well done, you, said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. You is saving all of our lives. Will you please get my brooch back for me? Sophie said. It belongs to the queen. The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump eater's ankle. The flesh lump eater howled. The BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during the schmozzle. When you was only sleeping 1 or 2 hours a day, you was sleeping extra doubly deep, said the BFG. The head of the Army and the Air Force drove forward once again in the Jeep. Her Majesty is going to be very pleased with me, said the head of the Army. I shall probably get a medal. What's our next move? Oh, now you is all driving me to my cave to load up my bottle of dreams, said the BFG. We can't waste time with that rubbish, said the Army General. It's the Queen's order, said Sophie. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 Jeeps drove across the beach to the BFG's cave, and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars to be loaded in all, and more than 5,000 in each Jeep. It took an hour to finish the job. While the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains in a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his back. Curiosity is killing the cat, said the BFG. What is it you've got in there? The head of the Army demanded of him. When he was sure that all of his precious dreams had been safely loaded onto the Jeeps, the BFG said, now he is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up the frightsome giants. The Jeeps drove back to the helicopters. The 50,000 dreams were carried carefully, jar by jar, onto the helicopters. The soldiers climbed back on board, but the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were laying. It was a fine sight to see them, these great air machines hovering over the trussed-up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the thundering of the engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting about on the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from their ropes and chains. I is flush bunkled, roared the flesh lump eater. I is split wiggled, yelled the child chewer. I is swoggled walloped, shouted the bellow bone cruncher. I is goose gruggled, shouted the man hugger. I is guggle swiped, shouted the man dripper. I is flunk-gungled, screamed the maid masher. I is slop-groggled, squawked the gizzard gulper. I is frog-swinkled, yowled the blood bottler. I is bop-mugged, screeched the butcher boy. Well, the 9 giant carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over them. Very strong steel hawsers with hooks at the end of them were lowered from the front of each helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giant's chain, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. And then very slowly, the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, but there was nothing they could do. The BFG and Sophie, once more resting comfortably in his ear, took off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around him and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle. All of those 9 helicopters winging through the sky, each one with a trussed-up, 50-foot-long giant slung under it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned out by the noise of the engines. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on their powerful searchlights and trained them on the galloping giant to keep sight of him. They flew right through the night, and they arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. That's a long time, all through the night. This chapter is called Feeding Time. Well, while the giants were being captured, a tremendous bustle and hustle was going on back home in England. Every earth digger and mechanical contrivance in the country had been mobilized to dig a colossal hole in which the 9 giants were to be permanently imprisoned. 10,000 men and 10,000 machines worked ceaselessly through the night under the powerful arc lights, and the massive task was completed just in time. The hole itself, imagine this, the hole itself was about twice the size of a football field and 500 feet deep. So think about how wide that is and how deep that is. The walls were perpendicular, and the engineers had calculated that there was no way a giant could escape once he was put in there. Even if all 9 giants were to stand on each other's shoulders, the top giant would still be 50 feet from the top of the hole. The 9 giant carrying helicopters hovered over the massive pits, and the giants, one by one, were lowered all the way down to the floor. But they were still trussed up, and now there was the tricky business of releasing them from their bonds. Nobody wanted to go down and do this, because the moment a giant was freed, he would be sure to turn on that wretched person and gobble him up. As usual, the BFG had the answer. I has told you before, he said, giants is never eating giants. So I is going down, and I shall untie them myself before you can say Jack Robinson. With thousands of fascinated spectators, including the Queen, peering into the pit, the BFG was lowered down in a rope. One by one, he released the giants. They stood up, stretched their stiffened limbs, and started leaping about in a fury. Why is they putting us down here in this grub-sludging hole, shouted the BFG. Because you is guzzling human beings, the BFG answered. I is always warning you not to do it, and you is never taking the titchiest bit of notice. In that case, the flesh lump eater bellowed, I think we is guzzling you instead. The BFG grabbed the dangling rope and was hoisted up out of the pit just in time. The great bulging sack he brought with him was from giant country, and he laid it down at the top of the pit. What's in there? The Queen asked him. The BFG put an arm into the sack and pulled out a gigantic black and white striped object the size of a man. Do you know what that is? Snozcumbers, he cried. This is the repulsant Snozcumber, Magister, and that is all we is going to give these disgusting giants from now on. May I taste it? The Queen cried. Oh, dear Magister, don't do it, cried the BFG. It is tasting troggle filth and pig squibble. With that, he tossed the Snozcumber down to the giants below. There is your supper, he shouted. Have a munch on that. He fished out more Snozcumbers from the sack, and then he threw them down. The giants howled and cursed. The BFG just laughed. It serves them right and center, he said. What will we feed them when the Snozcumbers are all used up? The Queen asked. Oh, they is never being used up, Magister, the BFG answered, smiling. I is also bringing a whole sack full of bungle of Snozcumber plants, which I is giving with your permission to the royal gardener to put in the soil. Then we is having an everlasting supply of these repulsive food to feed to these bloodthirsty giants. What a clever fellow you are, the queen said. You're not very well educated, but you are really nobody's fool. I can see that. The last chapter is called The Author. Every country in the world that had in the past been visiting the foul man-eating giants sent telegrams of congratulations and thanks to the BFG and Sophie. Kings and presidents and prime ministers and rulers of every kind showered the enormous giant and the little girl with compliments and thank yous, as well as all sorts of medals and presents. The ruler of India sent the BFG a magnificent elephant, the very thing he'd been wishing for his whole life. The king of Arabia sent him a camel. The Lama of Tibet sent him a llama each. Wellington sent him 100 pair of wellies each. Panama sent him some beautiful hats. The king of Sweden sent him a barrel full of sweet and sour pork. Jersey sent them pullovers. There was no end to the gratitude of the world. The queen herself gave orders that a special house was to be built, with tremendously high ceilings and enormous doors, should immediately be built in the Windsor Great Park next to her own castle for the BFG to live in. And a pretty little cottage was put up next door for Sophie. The BFG's house was to have a special dream storing room with hundreds of shelves in it where he could put his beloved bottles. And what's more, he was given the title of the Royal Dream Blower. He was allowed to go galloping off any place in England any night of the year to blow his splendid fizz wizards in through the windows of sleeping children. And letters poured into his house by the millions from children begging him to pay them a visit. Meanwhile, tourists from all over the globe came flocking to gaze down and wonder at the 9 horrendous man-eating giants stored in the pit. They came especially at feeding time when the snozcumbers were being thrown down to them by the keeper. And it was a pleasure to listen to the howls and horror coming up from the deep pit as the giants began chewing on the filthiest vegetable on the earth. There was only one disaster. 3 silly men who had drunk too much beer for lunch decided to climb over the fence of the surrounding pit. And of course, they fell in. There were yells of delight from the giants below, followed by the crunching of bones. The head keeper immediately put up a big notice and a fence saying, "It is forbidden to feed the giants." And after that, there were no more disasters. The BFG expressed a wish to learn how to speak properly, and Sophie herself, who loved him as she would a father, volunteered to give him lessons every day. She even taught him how to spell and write sentences, and he turned out to be a splendid, intelligent pupil. In his spare time, he read books. He became a tremendous reader. He read all of Charles Dickens, whom he no longer called Doll's Chickens. He read all of Shakespeare and literally thousands of other books. He also started to write essays about his past life. When Sophie read some of them, she said, "These are very good. I think perhaps one day you should become a real writer." "Oh, I would love that," said the BFG. "Do you think I could?" "I know you could," said Sophie. "Why don't you start writing a book about you and me?" "Very well," said the BFG. "I will give it a try." So he did. He worked hard on it, and in the end, he completed it. Rather shyly, he showed it to the Queen. The Queen read it aloud to her grandchildren, and then the Queen said, "I think we ought to get this put in a book, printed properly and published, so the other children can read it." Well, this was arranged, but because the BFG was a very modest giant, he wouldn't put his own name on it. He used somebody else's name instead. But where, you might ask, is this book that the BFG wrote? It's right here, and you have just finished reading it. Isn't that good? So the BFG wrote this book about his life and Sophie and everything that gone on. I hope you love this book as much as me. We're going to start a new one tomorrow called Bob, and I can't wait to go on another journey in another book with you. Have a really great day, and I will see you tomorrow.